Thank you, Jay. I'm glad Jay said that song leaders are weird. No, he didn't say song leaders are weird, did he? He said it's weird to lead singing. It is. And when I do these lessons, I go into a bedroom at our house and do it on by means of computer. And I feel like I'm talking to a wall. Actually, I'm looking now at some things on a shelf, and one of them is a nutcracker, and I am freaked out by nutcrackers anyway. So it's always strange for my audience to be that, and my son and daughter-in-law pictured there as well. But nevertheless, I digress. Let's get on and studying the lesson this evening. As children, or rather, maybe we should say as newborns, when we come into the world, we have sort of an automatic built-in defense system. And that defense system we learn as infants not only helps defend us, but it also helps us get what we want. And so we learn sort of from learned action. If we cry and fuss, mom and daddy's going to change our diapers. If we cry and fuss, mom and daddy's going to give us something to eat. If we cry and fuss, mom and daddy's going to pick us up. And so we learn we get what we want, whatever that is, based upon the needs at that time, by throwing a little fuss. But then as we get a little older, we begin to walk and begin to talk. One of the first lessons our parents teach us is what? It's the lesson of sharing. Now you share that toy, you share that food, you share whatever it may be. We're constantly telling our children to share, and we're trying to teach them that wonderful principle and that wonderful lesson. And such it is we hope that they learn. But what do we share in life? Well, we share what we have, don't we? First of all, we don't share or can't share what we don't have, but we share what we have. And we usually share what is good. Every once in a while, though, my wife will taste something and you'll say, well, is that good? And she'll say, no, here, have a bite. But she does that very, very rarely. But every once in a while she'll do that. I just laugh. No, if it's not good to you, I don't want any of that. But we share what is good. We share what we enjoy. If we enjoy something, what do? We share that. We share the story with others, or we share the activity with others, and we share in what we enjoy. And then we also share what is ours to give away. Really and truly, you can't share what you don't have. You can't share what you don't own, what's not yours. But what is yours, you can share. What does belong to you, you can give to others, or you can give at least part of it to others in order to let them enjoy the benefits and the fruits of what you have. As we think about Christians, we think about the fact that we as Christians are to be individuals that share and share with others. It's really a responsibility, isn't it? That God expects us as Christians to be folks that share and share in such a way as to give to others what they need and what we have. And I want us to think about that this evening, because I want us to think about, while we have that responsibility to share, and we may share our time, we may share ourselves, or we may share our blessings with others, we need to understand that the world needs us to share more than, if you will, just ourselves. Part of ourselves is kind of in what we're going to be talking about tonight, but I want to look a little bit more specifically. Because when we look at this world today, one of the things we do is we shake our heads, isn't it? We look at the morals. We look at where we're headed. We look at what's going on. We look at what's going on in the political world, no matter which side of the fence you may be on. And we shake our head because we see things that are going on and we say, how in the world has this world gotten to this point? How in the world has this world so digressed to the point where it is? Where have our morals, where have our manners where has our good taste gone? Well, let me share with you some things that I think that a Christian needs to learn to share, and that each one of us has the responsibility to share with the world. First of all, I think we need to share a trusting faith in a world that is full of doubt and despair. What is faith? We often, as Christians, use the word faith, and we say, well, you know, that's kind of one of those words that I understand what it is, but I have a little difficult time explaining it. I have a little difficult time trying to tell somebody what faith is, because faith is just something you have. Well, invariably, all of us have faith, but even the doubter has faith. He has faith in those things that he believes. It may not be God, it may not be Christ, it may not be his church, it may not be the Word of God, but he'll trust in something. Faith, by definition, is conviction full of joyful trust, conjoined with action. Now that's a mouthful in and of itself. But faith is conviction that certain things are, and a trust that the things that are the basis of our conviction are true and right. And then it is put together, conviction and trust is put together, and we act upon it, and that's faith. Someone has taken the word faith and made an acronym out of it and simply said that faith is forsaking all, I take him. And others have said that by using the word faith as an acronym, faithfully abiding in the Heavenly Father. Well, that's three good definitions of faith. Faith for the Christian is trusting in God and his will, and trusting in his Son every step of the way, and believing that, number one, they are real and they are true. Number two, believing that the word that God through inspiration gave to the writers, and thus he through time has preserved for mankind, is true and right and good. As Christians then, we believe that and we hold to that because we walk by faith and not by sight, right? Isn't that what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7? And so we as Christians, having a faith and a trust in God, believe in his strength. We believe in his care. We believe in his promises, and we believe as well in taking a risk for him. And so ultimately we trust in him. And as Solomon said in Proverbs 3, verse 5 and 6, trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Lean not upon your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll bring it to pass. Well, that's a great and wonderful admonition and thought, isn't it? That we as Christians trust in the Lord, and basically if we trust in the Lord, he's going to bring whatever we need. He's going to bring whatever is needful to us. He's going to take care of us. And so faith then gets us through because I accept what he says, and I acknowledge him, being God, as the guide for my life and the administrator of his will in and to my life, and that it will be exactly what I need. Psalm 18, the psalmist said, I love you, or I will love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord's my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my shield, and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. The psalmist begins that psalm there by talking about the greatness of God, the might of God, the power of God, and the protection of God. We as Christians believe all of those things. And because we believe of those things, we need to share with the world that faith. You see, the world lives really in despair because it doesn't know what it believes, or it believes in things that ultimately fail the test. While there are many ideas and ideals of what is right, none are sufficient, and all fall upon themselves, but not God. The world that lives in doubt and despair needs to turn to God. And the psalmist reminds us in Psalm 32 that if we follow God, that he'll give us forgiveness, he'll give us peace, he'll give us joy. And so we as individuals need to, number one, trust in God, but number two, we need to share that trust with others. Story is told of a man that fell off the side of a cliff. As he was falling down the cliff, there was a tree that was growing out of the side of the cliff, and he grabbed a hold and he was hanging on. And as the story, granted made up, the story is as the man was hanging there, he said, Lord, help me, save me. And so the Lord said, I'm here. He said, do you believe in me? And the man said, yes, Lord, I really believe in you. I believe in you with all my heart, but I can't hang on to this limb much longer. And the Lord said, well, that's all right. If you really believe, let go, and everything will be all right. The man thought for a moment, and he said, hey, is there anybody else up there? Well, faith does what needs to be done based upon what God says needs to take place. And the world needs that faith. But then a second thing that the world needs is the world needs a way of love. We sadly today are living in a world seemingly of hate. Folks can't stand one another. And it's so sad to see that folks do not like one another and folks cannot get along with one another. And now, at this point in time, I'm not just talking about races of people. You see, neighbors can't get along with neighbors, friends that can't get along with friends. You see, sometimes even in church, folks can't get along with themselves. As Christians, we need to know that we need to be individuals that love one another. Love is, after all, according to John 13, verse 35, it's the badge. By this, Jesus said, that all men shall know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another. It becomes our buffer while we are to watch, stand fast in the faith. We're to be individuals that love, according to 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 13. And it ultimately then becomes the bond that holds us together. Love is important. Love is the greatest of virtues, isn't it? In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, there's discussion evidently in Corinth. There are 9 spiritual gifts that are listed in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning in verse 12. And evidently there were some in Corinth that thought one spiritual gift was greater than the other, that the gift of tongues was so greater than the ability to interpret those tongues, that the gift of prophecy was greater than maybe the ability to interpret dreams. Paul tells them that no one gift there that he mentions there that was within the church at that time was more important or greater than the other. And he goes on to talk about in that chapter, and this is 1 Corinthians chapter 12, he goes on to talk about while no one gift is more important or greater than the other, he says, let each member within the body of Christ use his gift, his talents, his ability for the furtherance of the gospel, and do such working together in unity within the congregation. But then he goes on, and as the way it is divided for us into chapters, now notice and remember, Paul didn't write in chapters, but Paul says, I'm going to show you a more excellent way. And then he talks about the way is the way of love. And while he defines love in the first 3 verses of 1 Corinthians 13, he then begins to talk about what love is and what it is not, and what it does and does not do. He talks about how that love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy, love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. That's love. Dear friends, that capsulizes in very short order exactly how we as Christians are to live our life. That we are to live a life of love, loving others, no matter what it costs, no matter what it may cost us. We're to share that love, and we're to share that helping with others. You might say, well, preacher, I have a hard time seeing love. I understand that if you define love as an emotion, you might say, well, that's difficult. But love exhibits itself to others. Bart Starr was famous football players in the 60s and early 70s. Bart Starr gave his son, for every A on every paper that he brought home, he'd give him a dime. Bart Starr, one Sunday, he went out to play a game, and it was an away game. And he didn't play very well, and the team didn't play very well. And they lost, and he pretty well got beat into the ground, tackled several times, and he felt bad about the game that he played. He knew the media had roughed him up pretty good, and the plane ride was basically across the United States, and so it took a long time, and he didn't get back in. He didn't get home till late. It was time for bed. His children were already in bed. But when he laid down on his pillow, there was a note from his son. Dad, I thought you played a great game. Love, and his name was Bart as well. Love, Bart. And taped to that piece of paper were 2 dimes. That's love. As Christians, we need to share that kind of love with everyone we come in contact with. The driver that's slow in front of us. The driver that's got us boxed in. The individual that passes us in line at the grocery store. The individual that, in this day and age, that walks the wrong way up an aisle. The neighbor that maybe throws something across the fence into our yard. Maybe not intentionally, but nevertheless does. On and on and on we could go with the list. As Christians, it's our responsibility to show the way of love. To love one another. We need to share that with this world. In a world of hate, we need to show the way of love. But then thirdly, as Christians, what do we need to share? We need to share a heart of humility, especially to a world of folks that's self-centered. What is humility? Well, humility, the best way I really know to define that is humility is understanding who we are and where we fit in. The opposite of humility is pride. Pride makes a mess of our priorities, doesn't it? The church at Laodicea was condemned. Jesus said that you sit back and he tells them, he says, I wish that you basically stood for something. But he said, you yourself say that you're rich, you've become wealthy, you have need of nothing. And he says, don't you know that you're poor and wretched and miserable and blind? Don't you know the condition that you're in? No, pride said, no, we're doing well. We're all right. Well, we live in a world of prideful people. We're self-centered. It's all about me. And that keeps me from seeing not only myself as I am, but seeing others. The humble heart sees themselves as they are and understands that while they are not perfect and they need to be worked upon, that they are constantly busy in trying to be humble. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, James wrote in James chapter 4 and verse 10, and he'll lift you up. We're not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to, but to think soberly according as God has dealt to every man a measure of faith, according to Romans chapter 12 and verse 3. You know, I'm convinced, maybe wrongfully so, but I'm convinced that the reason Peter denied the Lord was because of his lack of humility. In Matthew chapter 26, Jesus is talking to his disciples there, and he says that there will be some that will be ashamed of me, and there will be some that will deny me. And Peter spoke up, and he said, Lord, I will never deny you. I'll never say anything against you. Jesus said, Peter, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. Peter says, not so, Lord. We know the story, the end of Matthew 26, don't we? Sure enough, before the cock crows, Peter denies the Lord. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. If Peter had had the humility of heart that he needed, he would not have denied the Lord. You might say, well, he wouldn't have stood up under what Jesus told him. Jesus would have been a false prophet. Well, no, Jesus knew Peter and knew what was about to happen. Humility says, okay, Lord, I understand who I am, where I am, and what I'm supposed to be. And I understand that my heart needs to be a pliable heart that's willing to listen to you and to your will and to do what you would have me to do. Humility of heart says, Lord, you speak, I'll listen. You tell me, and I'll do. The world needs that. The world has seemingly believed, for whatever reason, or begun to believe, that they are deserving of what they receive, and they should receive anything and everything. As Christians, we know that's not so. As Christians, we know that we serve a great God, and we are his servants. And being servants of God means that we're willing to say, it's not all about me, it's about you, Lord. I couldn't help but think, and I guess I had thought about this before, I'm sure I had, but as George was reading scripture this morning for the Lord's Supper, one of the words that just jumped out at me as he was reading and trying to get our minds to thinking about the sacrifice that was made for us is that word sacrifice. It was mentioned 2 or 3 times in what George read there. And I thought, we don't understand or remember or think about the sacrifice that Christ made for us. That's the type of life that we live, a humble life that's willing to sacrifice for the good of others. That's humility. As Christians, we need to share that with the world. But fourthly, we need to share an objective truth in a world of abstracts. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, just listen for a minute and maybe I can make myself a little clearer. We all live by standards, don't we? And those standards are important. Take, for instance, a gallon. I don't know, didn't look up how many ounces are in a gallon, how many quarts are in a gallon, how many pints are in a gallon. We know all of those things. We sit and think about them, 4 quarts in a gallon and so forth and so on. And we could break it all down. But when we go to the gas station to get a gallon of gas, we want a gallon of gas. We don't want what might be considered a half a gallon. We don't want 3/4 of a gallon. We want a gallon. And every time we go to the gas station, if we want, say, just 1 gallon of gas, we want 1 gallon of gas. And because of that, in the United States, we have a standard of weights and measurements, which those pumps are checked from time to time to make sure that they're actually giving a gallon of gas as they say. In our world today, we use a great many standards, don't we? Some folks use their conscience. Whatever their conscience says, that's their guide, that's their standard. Some use popularity. Well, this is what everybody else is doing. This is how everybody else is doing. This is how everybody else is acting. I sat in a meeting once in which the church treasurer said, he was, as the elders were talking about the point of giving, the treasurer said, well, I give in accordance to how everybody else gives. I was so floored that I thought immediately, the verse says, according to what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 16, to give as you've been given to, not as others have been given to. The objective truth is a truth, though, that has a standard, and that standard doesn't change. We can use our conscience. We can use popularity. We can use the peers. This is what everybody else is doing. We can ultimately say all things are relative, that it doesn't really matter. I had a man sitting in my office back a few years ago, and he was talking about morality. And he was talking about things. He said, he told me, he said, preacher, he said, you see things in black and white, good and evil, right and wrong. He said, I have more colors in my coloring box than you have. He said, I see shades, but I also see colors. And yet God tells us that he has an absolute truth. Think about just 3 verses that you're probably very familiar with, but think about them again. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 16, Paul said, I am set for defense of the gospel. Not a gospel, not some gospel, not my gospel or your gospel, not the Romans gospel or the Church of Colossae gospel or you at Philippi, your gospel. He said, I'm set for defense of the gospel, the truth. A second verse that you're probably familiar with is Jude 3. Jude says, contend earnestly for the faith. Once again, Jude didn't say contend for a faith, some faith, whatever faith you want to contend for. He says there is an absolute body of faith. Paul said in Ephesians chapter 4, there's one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And so then go one more. How about 2 John verses 9 and 10? John says that whosoever transgresses and abides not in the doctrine of Christ. The word doctrine there just simply means teaching. Whoever transgresses and does not abide in the teachings of Christ does not have God. And so John says there's a teaching there. It's the teaching of Christ. And that teaching you and I must abide in. We as Christians need to share with the world that truth. Not just that truth, but we need to share with them that it is an absolute objective truth. It is not an abstract. It is not, well, if you want to, or if you think you might, or you should, but, if you don't want to, no, it's not that. It is an absolute objective truth. We need to share that with the world. But then lastly, we'll make this very quick. We need to share with the world God's amazing grace. Jay mentioned this tonight so well and so eloquently in his prayer right before Steve's song. God's grace. Aren't you thankful for it? We had a sermon on it just a few weeks ago on Sunday morning. Man's failure today does not have to be fatal for eternity, does it? One of the things that I think is so sad is that the world today pictures, and many folks, if you ask them about the Church of Christ, will tell you, well, you're the folks that think you all are the only ones going to heaven. And usually then people will start in on you, and I want you to know you're not perfect. I agree with them. I tell them, you're right, I'm not perfect. And I don't know of a Christian that is perfect. That's why we meet together on Sundays. That's why we meet together on Wednesdays, to encourage one another, to build one another up, to help each other, to help us get back into the right way. We understand that grace, being the unmerited favor of God, is really God's riches at Christ's expense. God's grace is for all of us. It's not just for a few people. It's for the whole world. And while God's grace is for the whole world, it provides. You know, God, who is rich in his mercy with his great love, according to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 4, God's grace is not just about salvation. It's God's riches. And so God's grace provides. It provides that which helps us, the strength that helps us and sustains us in trials. God's grace gives me the strength and help to deliver in the midst of temptation, to guide me in life. He provides, God's grace provides for me in my distress, in my comfort, in my times of great victory. God's grace comforts me in my sorrows. God's grace saves me in death and crowns me in heaven. I need God's grace, don't you? The story is told of a large piece of marble that was going to be sculpted into a sculpture of Napoleon. This marble had been brought over from one of the Greek isles, the Greek island of Peros. The sculptor's name was Genova. Genova began to work on the piece of marble, and then all of a sudden he stopped. He said, I can't work upon this marble. It's flawed. It's got a flaw in it, and it's not perfectly white. It's not perfectly pure. He said, I will not further lay my chisel upon this piece of marble. He rejected it. Think about when God, with his great eye of detection, looks upon us in the purest of human characters and finds flaws in our life. Aren't you glad he doesn't reject us like Genova did this piece of marble? Aren't you thankful that God looks upon us and sees that flaw and says, that's all right, I'll work on him and I'll work with him. And I can save him in the end, and I will save him in the end if he'll follow me and my will. What it requires of us, though, is understanding that God has an objective truth. To be humble of heart enough to say, okay, God, I want you to work with me, and I'll follow you because I trust in you and I believe you. Dear friends, these are but a few things. I had a list of quite a few things that I personally think that we as Christians need to share with the world. We'll come back some other time in the future and look at some more of these. But these are things that are vital and important. And all of us as Christians should have in our lives and understand in our lives. But all of us as Christians should as well, share with others, for the world needs these things. Why? Because these are the things of God. I hope you'll give thought to these things. I hope maybe that you jotted them down. If you just remember faith, love, humility, truth, and grace, you'll have it. We thank you for listening. We hope that you have a great day tomorrow, being an official holiday, Labor Day. We hope that you enjoy the day with friends and family, if at all possible. And we thank you for listening. And until Wednesday night, may God bless you and keep you is my prayer.